Hello, and welcome to Credit Storytellers. A space where we don't just talk about numbers on a screen, but about the lives behind them. The anxiety, the hope, the quiet victories. If you've ever laid awake at night with the weight of a number pressing on your chest, if you've ever felt a jolt of fear opening a bill or checking your bank balance, then this story is for you. My story begins not with a budget spreadsheet, but with a ceiling. I was lying on my back on a worn-out carpet, staring at a crack in the plaster, feeling utterly and completely buried. I was $50,000 in debt. Student loans, a car payment that was far too ambitious, and the steady creep of credit card balances from years of telling myself, I'll deal with it later. My salary? It was modest. Unremarkable. It was the kind of salary that covered life, but never seemed to make a dent in that looming, growing shadow. For years, I told myself the same stories. I need this to live. Everyone has debt. I'll earn more someday and fix it. But that day never magically arrived. Instead, what arrived was a moment of crystalline, terrifying clarity. It was a Tuesday. I had received a bonus, a small, but meaningful amount. And before it even hit my account, it was gone. Allocated to minimum payments. It wasn't a reward, it was a ransom payment to my past choices. I felt no joy, no relief, only a profound sense of being owned. That was my awakening. The moment I realized I was not in a financial crisis, but a personal one. I had surrendered my agency, my future, and my peace of mind. And on that Tuesday, I decided I wanted it back. This is the story of how I did it. Not with a secret trick, but with a series of steps, a change in philosophy, and a stubborn kind of self-compassion. This is not a get-rich-quick scheme. It is a get-free-slow guide. There is a particular quality of silence that exists only in the deep night, when the world has softened to shadows and the only sound is the faint, rhythmic hum of your own worry. It was in that silence, on a nondescript Tuesday, that I found myself lying on the floor of my apartment, staring at a hairline crack in the ceiling that seemed, in that moment, to map the precise fractures in my life. The carpet fibers pressed against my back, a dull grounding sensation that did nothing to counter the profound feeling of being unmoored. I was not thinking of budgets or interest rates. I was simply feeling the weight, a physical, pressing presence on my chest, of a single, staggering number, $50,000. That was the sum total of my financial captivity. It was not the result of one catastrophic mistake, but rather a quiet, decade-long accumulation of choices made on autopilot. It was the student loans for a degree I believed was a passport to a certain life. It was the reliable but overly expensive car I financed, convinced it was a necessity for a professional image. It was the credit card balances that grew so gradually I barely noticed, a medical bill here, a vacation I couldn't truly afford there, the countless small conveniences charged to avoid confronting the dwindling balance in my checking account. I had curated a life that appeared, from the outside, to be one of modest stability. On the inside, I was an accountant of my own decline, meticulously logging minimum payments that felt less like progress and more like a permanent subscription to my past anxieties. My salary was unexceptional. It was the median, reasonable compensation for my role in a mid-sized city. It covered my rent, my groceries, my utilities, and with careful management, it even allowed for the occasional dinner out. But it was utterly incapable of engaging with the principle of my debt. It fought a perpetual, losing battle against the interest, those relentless, compounding fees that felt like a tax on my poor judgment. For years, I employed a suite of psychological defenses to manage the cognitive dissonance. I told myself that debt was a modern inevitability, a universal burden carried by everyone my age. I indulged in the soothing fantasy of future prosperity, a promotion, a windfall, a miraculous upturn in my fortunes that would allow me to erase the problem in one decisive move. I practiced a form of financial compartmentalization, treating each debt in isolation so I would never have to confront the terrifying aggregate. This delicate, anxious equilibrium held for a surprisingly long time. Then came the bonus. It was not a life-changing sum, but it was significant, a few $1,000s, a recognition of a year of hard work. When the email notification arrived from my employer, a spontaneous spark of joy ignited. For a few hours, I entertained delightful possibilities, a long-delayed trip, a new piece of furniture to replace the worn-out one in my living room, a generous investment in a hobby. It was a brief, intoxicating taste of possibility. That taste turned to ash the following evening, as I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open. Methodically, almost ritualistically, I began to allocate the bonus funds. The entirety of it was distributed across various online portals, siphoned into the gaping maws of credit card and loan accounts. The process was clinical and efficient. With a few clicks, the number in my savings account ticked up slightly, but the psychological weight did not budge. The bonus was not a reward, it was a ransom payment. I had not earned a celebration, I had merely purchased another few months of the status quo, the same anxiety, the same constraints, the same ceiling. It was in the hollow aftermath of this transaction that I found myself on the floor, gazing upward. The crack in the ceiling seemed to widen. The silence amplified a single, piercing question that cut through all my rationalizations. Is this all there is? This was the awakening. It was not a shout, but a whisper of profound exhaustion. The exhaustion of running on a treadmill of my own making. I realized in that moment that my problem was not fundamentally numerical. It was existential. I had surrendered my sense of agency, my ability to direct my own life, to a collection of past decisions. My future income was already spoken for. My labor was not building a life, it was servicing a ghost. The debt was no longer just a financial figure, it was the primary stakeholder in my time, my energy, and my peace. This realization, while stark, carried within it the first faint ember of hope. If the problem was one of agency, then the solution must be, too. The path forward would not begin with a higher salary, though that would come later in small ways. It would begin with a reclamation of self. It would require me to move from a passive state of being acted upon by my circumstances to an active state of authoring my response to them. The first action of this reclamation felt almost foolish in its simplicity. It required no money, no negotiation, no complex strategy. It required only a brutal, uncompromising honesty. The following Saturday morning, I made a pot of coffee, opened a blank spreadsheet on my computer, and began what I would later call the Great Accounting. I gathered every financial artifact of my life. I logged into each digital portal, the student loan servicer, the bank for my auto loan, the 3 different credit card websites. I opened the filing cabinet where I kept paper statements in a folder I usually avoided. One by one, I transcribed the data onto a fresh, blank canvas. Column A, the creditor. Column B, the total balance. Column C, the interest rate. Column D, the minimum monthly payment. As the list grew, so did a tightness in my throat. Seeing the individual numbers was one thing, witnessing them assemble into a legion was another. The final entry was a private student loan with a balance just over $12,000. I entered the data, my fingers cold and clumsy on the keys. I created a final row at the bottom. In cell B12, I typed a formula, equals sum, B2, B11. I paused, my cursor hovering over the enter key. This was the moment of truth. Taking a breath that felt too shallow, I pressed it. The number appeared, $49,872.14. The silence in the room was absolute. The number sat on the screen, glowing with a cold, digital finality. It was no longer an abstraction, a diffuse cloud of worry. It was quantifiable. It was specific. It was knowable. A wave of nausea passed through me, followed immediately by a paradoxical and profound sense of calm. For the first time in a decade, I was looking at the enemy, and I could see its exact size and shape. The monster under the bed had been dragged into the light. The unknown, which had been the source of so much diffuse terror, was now known. In that moment of terrifying clarity, I felt a shift. The weight was still there, but it had been transferred from my chest onto my shoulders. It was a burden to be carried, not a force to be crushed by. I had taken the first, most critical step on the path to freedom. I had told myself the truth. With that truth now glaring back at me from the screen, I understood that the journey ahead would be a marathon, not a sprint. It would be powered not by a sudden windfall, but by a new philosophy, one built on intentionality, systematic action, and a radical form of self-compassion that understood sustainability was more important than speed. The climb out of a $50,000 hole on a modest salary would require more than math. It would require a complete reconstruction of my relationship with money, and ultimately, with myself. The next phase would involve a deep, non-judgmental audit of where my money was actually going, a process of discovery that would reveal not just spending habits, but the emotional triggers and hidden stories behind every dollar spent. But for now, in the quiet of that Saturday morning, I simply sat with the number. I had faced it. And in doing so, I had begun the process of taking my life back. With the reality sheet printed and placed squarely on my desk, a tangible monument to my predicament, the initial wave of daunting clarity settled into a more pragmatic, albeit anxious, resolve. Knowing the total was only the diagnosis, the treatment would require a detailed understanding of the patient. I had stared at the static mountain of debt, now I needed to understand the dynamic landscape of my own financial behavior, the income streams, the outflows, and the subtle, daily choices that had created the conditions for this mountain to exist. This phase was not about judgment, but about observation. I was becoming an ethnographer of my own economic life. My first operational task was what I termed the transactional autopsy. For a full, normal month, I committed to tracking every single financial transaction I made, regardless of amount or perceived significance. I chose a simple method, a small notepad I carried everywhere, complemented by the Notes app on my phone. The goal was absolute granularity. This was not budgeting yet, this was pure, unfiltered data collection. The process was illuminating, and at times, profoundly uncomfortable. I began logging the obvious: rent, utilities, car payment, gas, and groceries. But the true revelation lay in the periphery, in the transactions I had trained myself to mentally discard. The $4.25 latte purchased automatically on my way to work, a daily ritual I barely registered. The $12 lunch ordered to my desk because I hadn't planned a meal. The $9.99 monthly charge for a streaming service I hadn't opened in weeks. The $35 impulse purchase at a pharmacy for items I didn't need. The $3 parking meter fee, the $1.50 in-app purchase, the $22 quick bite with a friend. By the end of the first week, a pattern emerged. My financial leak was not a single burst pipe, but a network of fine, almost invisible cracks. The large, fixed expenses were formidable, but they were known quantities. It was this relentless drip of small, unconscious, and often emotion-driven spending, the convenience premium, the boredom tax, the social fee, that systematically eroded my capacity to address the larger debt. I was not living an extravagantly beyond my means lifestyle. I was engaged in a slow, steady seepage that kept me perpetually at the line of financial equilibrium, with nothing left to deploy against the principal of my debts. My money was disappearing into the atmosphere of daily life, leaving no trace behind but a statement balance. Armed with this forensic data, I moved to construct my framework for change, the sanctuary budget. I consciously rejected terms like austerity plan or spending freeze. Such language frames financial discipline as a punishment, a state of lack to be endured. I needed a framework that felt protective, not punitive. I was not building a prison, I was designing a sanctuary, a defined space of security from which I could operate without constant fear. I started with the immutable pillars, my non-negotiables. These were the expenses required for basic safety and civic existence: rent, utilities, electric, water, internet, a baseline grocery allocation, insurance premiums, and the minimum payments on all my debts. These were the walls and roof of my sanctuary, They were non-negotiable because without them, the structure would collapse. Then, I addressed the critical, often overlooked, element of human psychology, sustainability. I created two small but foundational categories. The first was compassion spending. I allocated a modest, fixed amount each month, initially just $30, that was mine to spend with zero guilt, scrutiny, or requirement to log. This could be a coffee with a book, a matinee movie ticket, a small plant. Its purpose was to acknowledge that I was a human being on a long journey, not a debt repayment machine. Total deprivation, I understood, leads to resentment and eventual rebellion. This category was a pressure valve. The second was the emergency buffer seed. Knowing that unexpected expenses were a certainty, not a possibility, I allocated a tiny amount, $20, to a separate savings account each month. Its insignificance was its power. It was not meant to cover an emergency, it was meant to shatter the paralyzing myth that, I can't save anything. It was a symbolic gesture, a seed planted in barren soil, affirming the principle of paying myself first, even if the amount was almost laughable. With my sanctuary boundaries drawn, I could now see my available leverage, the sum left after non-negotiables and my two psychological categories. This was the capital for my offensive. It was not a large number, perhaps $175 to $200 a month, gleaned from the aggregation of all those tracked leaks I had now consciously plugged. Now came the strategic decision on how to deploy this leverage against the debt itself. I researched the prevailing methodologies, the debt avalanche, targeting the debt with the highest interest rate first for mathematical efficiency, and the debt snowball, targeting the smallest balance first for psychological momentum. For someone with a high-income surplus, the avalanche is objectively superior in terms of interest saved. But I was not that person. On my modest salary, with a modest monthly surplus, I needed fuel more than I needed perfect mathematical optimization. I needed proof of concept. I needed a win. I chose the debt snowball method. I reopened my reality sheet and sorted the debts not by interest rate, but by total outstanding balance, from smallest to largest. At the top was store credit card A with a balance of $942 at a 22% interest rate. Below it were others, a $2,500 personal loan, a $6,700 credit card, and so on, down to the monolithic $12,000 private student loan and the $15,000 federal student loan. The strategy was mechanical. I would continue making the minimum payment on every debt. But every single dollar of my available leverage, that $175 to $200, would be concentrated as an extra payment on store credit card A. I would attack it with singular focus until it was gone. Then, would take the total amount I had been paying toward that card, the minimum plus the extra, and apply that entire cash flow to the next smallest debt, creating a growing snowball of monthly payment power. The psychological effect of this focus was immediate. The overwhelming $50,000 problem shrank in my mind to a $942 problem. That was a number I could grapple with. I visualized it, tracked it on a simple chart taped to my wall, and felt a surge of purpose with every extra $50 I sent its way. It became a game, a puzzle. I scrutinized my transactional log with renewed vigor, not with shame, but with the excitement of a prospector, looking for any extra grain of sand I could add to my snowball. This process naturally led to the sustainable amplification. I understood that while plugging leaks was essential, increasing the volume of water flowing into the bucket would accelerate everything. A dramatic career change or a second full-time job was not feasible without risking burnout, which would doom the entire project. Instead, I sought a gentle rise. I assessed my existing, marketable skills. I had a professional background in writing and a keen eye for detail. I created a profile on 2 freelance platforms and began bidding on small, discrete projects, editing university application essays, proofreading business documents, ghostwriting blog posts. I strictly limited this work to 5 dedicated hours per week, Sunday evenings. This made it manageable, a focused side mission rather than a new life. Crucially, I instituted a firewall, Every single dollar earned from this work was transferred immediately to my checking account and then directly to the debt snowball. It was not my money, it was my freedom fund. Simultaneously, I initiated the great exchange. I looked at my possessions not as personal treasures, but as latent currency. I conducted a ruthless inventory of my apartment, asking of every item, does this bring me active joy or utility, or is it merely clutter? I sold textbooks online. I consigned gently used clothing. I sold a collection of vintage cameras I never used to a specialist dealer. The most significant transaction was my car. I ran the numbers and realized that my monthly payment, combined with full coverage insurance, was a massive drag on my snowball. I researched, found a reliable, 8-year-old used model from a reputable brand, and made the switch. The sale of my car and the purchase of the older one, paid for in cash from the sale, eliminated a $320 monthly payment and reduced my insurance by $80 a month. That $400 was instantly folded into my snowball. It was not a downgrade in lifestyle, it was a strategic upgrade in financial velocity. Months passed. The snowball began to roll. The day I made the final payment on that first $942 credit card balance, I felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated victory. It was a small debt in the grand scheme, but the psychological impact was monumental. It was tangible, irrevocable proof that my actions could change my reality. That small win generated a disproportionate amount of motivational energy, propelling me with renewed conviction toward the next balance on the list. The method was working. The sanctuary was holding. I was no longer a passive debtor, I was an active, strategic operator in my own financial life. The journey was far from over, but the path, once invisible, was now clearly lit before me. The architecture of my new financial life, the sanctuary budget, the snowball method, the gentle rise of side income, was sound in theory. But life, in its persistent and unpredictable manner, is the ultimate stress test for any theory. The true measure of this system would not be its performance during months of smooth execution, but its resilience in the face of inevitable disruption. I had built a vehicle for a journey, now I would learn to navigate the potholes. This phase of the journey taught me the art of the pivot, not the quit. Roughly 14 months into my plan, as my snowball was gaining satisfying momentum against a mid-sized credit card, my car, the reliable, older model I had strategically downgraded to, required a major repair. The estimate was $1,200. A year prior, this would have been a catastrophe, sending me spiraling into despair and likely onto another credit card. Now, it was a logistical problem to be solved. The emotion was concern, not panic. I had my microscopic emergency buffer, which had grown to a few $100s, not enough. So, I enacted a predefined contingency protocol. I did not view this as a failure. I viewed it as a necessary tactical retreat. For that month, and part of the next, I temporarily paused all extra debt snowball payments. Every dollar of my available leverage and side income was redirected into a dedicated repair fund. I communicated this change to myself not as, I've fallen off the wagon, but as, I am prioritizing the stability of my vehicle, which is essential to my income and thus to the long-term mission. Within 6 weeks, the car was repaired, paid for in cash. Then, calmly and without drama, I resumed the snowball payments at their previous level. The setback had cost me time, approximately 2 months of progress on the debt, but it had not cost me additional interest or, more importantly, my sense of agency. I had pivoted. I had not quit. This experience refined the entire endeavor. It was no longer a rigid, brittle plan, but a living, adaptable system. The budget was a blueprint, but I was the builder, empowered to adjust for weather. This cultivated a deeper, more substantive form of confidence than the initial euphoria of my first debt paid off. It was the confidence of resilience. As the months accumulated into years, a profound internal transformation began to outpace the numerical one on my spreadsheet. The most significant change was not in my net worth, but in my nervous system. The low-grade, perpetual hum of financial anxiety that had been my life's background noise for a decade began to fade. It did not disappear overnight, but it quieted, replaced by a growing sense of predictability and control. I slept through the night. The jolt of fear that once accompanied opening my banking app diminished, then vanished. Checking my accounts became an act of stewardship, not dread. The mental energy that had been perpetually consumed by worry, by calculations of scarcity, by the exhausting performance of normality, was gradually freed. It was as if a portion of my cognitive bandwidth, long held hostage, had been released back to me. The final debt was the oldest and largest, the federal student loan. The snowball was now substantial, a consolidated monthly sum that represented years of incremental effort, side hustle income, sold possessions, reallocated, leaked money, and the cascading minimum payments from 8 other defeated balances. Making the last payment was an act of profound anticlimax. I clicked Submit on a familiar website interface. A green confirmation screen appeared. There were no fireworks, no confetti from my laptop. The quiet of my apartment remained unchanged. The significance unfolded slowly, in the hours and days that followed. It manifested not as a singular event, but as a new quality of existence. The next evening, I went for a walk. As I walked, I became aware of a peculiar and wonderful sensation, spaciousness. It was a mental and emotional spaciousness. The future, which for so long had been a prescripted narrative of obligation stretching out before me, was suddenly a blank page. The mental calendar that was perpetually marked with payment due dates was now clear. The energy that had been devoted to managing my lack was now available for creation, for curiosity, for simply being present in my own life without the shadow of a financial terminus looming. I had not just paid off debt, I had purchased back my own attention and my future potential. I had traded dollars for freedom, and the exchange rate was invaluable. This journey led me to a fundamental redefinition of what credit truly means. We speak of credit scores and credit reports as the official ledgers of our financial identity. But those are merely reflections, lagging indicators. True credit is the trust you build with your future self. It is the credibility you earn in your own eyes by making a plan and following through, by honoring your commitments to yourself. My financial credit score improved dramatically through this process, but that was a side effect. The core repair was the restoration of my own self-trust, my own agency. I had proven to myself that I could navigate complexity, endure delayed gratification, and solve formidable problems with consistent, small actions. The narrative I told myself shifted from, I am someone buried by debt, to, I am someone who solves difficult problems. That identity is the most valuable asset I gained. Therefore, if you find yourself in a landscape similar to my starting point, paralyzed by the scale of a number, understand this: the primary obstacle is not arithmetic. It is overwhelm. The path forward is not hidden, it is simply broken down into steps that are smaller than your fear anticipates. Your journey does not begin with paying off $50,000. It begins with step 1, the sacred honesty. It begins with opening a document, a word processor, a spreadsheet, a blank page in a notebook, and writing down a single truth. List one debt. Just one. Write its name and its balance. Look at it. Acknowledge it without judgment. That act alone is a monumental shift from passive anxiety to active engagement. You have moved from being a character in a stressful story to becoming its author. From that one honest line, you can begin your own great accounting. You can initiate your own transactional autopsy for a month, not to condemn, but to comprehend. You can design not a prison of restriction, but a sanctuary budget that includes compassion for your humanity. You can choose your method, Snowball or Avalanche, based on what psychological fuel you need most. You can look for your own gentle rise, a skill you already possess that can be monetized for a few hours a week. You can conduct a great exchange, viewing your possessions as potential energy for your liberation. The system is proven. But the power to activate it resides in you, in the decision to take that first, quiet, honest step. The mountain is moved not by a single Herculean shove, but by the relentless, patient carrying away of small stones. You possess that resilience. Your story of constraint can become your story of unparalleled freedom. It begins not with a shout, but with a whisper of truth to yourself. That is where your new chapter starts. Thank you for listening to this chapter of Credit Storytellers. If this resonated with you, if it made that mountain in front of you feel just a little more climbable, please subscribe. Because every week, we share another true story of financial turnaround, not from gurus, but from people like you and me, who found their way through. Share your own first step, or just say hello, in the comments below. Let's build a community where we replace shame with strategy, and fear with forward motion. Remember, your financial story is still being written. Make the next chapter a good one. Until next time, be kind to yourself, and take that first step.